My guest today is Steve Davies.
What I'm going to do is talk about the argument I make in a book which is just coming out tomorrow here in the UK, The Great Realignment, Why the New Right-Wing Politics is Here to Stay. And so what I'm going to do, with your permission, is to basically set out what the argument is that I make in that book. First of all, what is the book intended to do? Well, it's intended to explain and make sense of developments in contemporary or recent politics since roughly 2006, 2007, since just before the financial crisis. It is not a work of polemic or of exhortation or advocacy. My aim in this book, although I have very strong opinions about many of the things I discuss and describe, is simply to give a dispassionate and neutral analytical account. And this involves my, amongst other things, describing and explaining views with which I myself disagree, but doing so, I hope, in as neutral, dispassionate and fair and honest a way as I can do. So that's my goal. I am actually a historian by training, and the way I think about the project of this book is that I imagine that I'm a historian from about 100 years in the future, writing about the history of the last 10 years and the current day. So I think that sort of is a way of putting myself into the right dispassionate frame of mind. So what is it that I'm trying to explain? Well, essentially, in the last 17 to 20 years, what we have seen is a massive political upheaval across the developed world and in many parts of the developing world as well. This upheaval has two aspects. One of them is the rise in one country after another of a new kind of politics. A kind of politics that's usually, and I think rather misleadingly, described as populist. I think there are other better labels for it. National collectivist is a term I've used myself. Maybe national populist is one that makes more sense. It's a politics centered around issues like immigration, opposition to free trade, opposition to global governance, the assertion of the rights of democratic majorities over the power of courts and international agreements. And this is a kind of politics that has gone in one country after another from the fringes, with parties getting maybe 1 or 2% of the vote, at most 7 or 8%, to becoming a major player, or even in some places, as in Hungary and Poland, being in power. So we're looking at parties like the National Rally, the RN in France, the Vox Party in Spain, Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy, the governing party in Italy these days, the AFD in Germany, first UKIP and now Reform in the UK, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. I could go on and on and on. And of course, most prominently, the movement associated with Donald Trump, so-called MAGA movement now, which has successfully captured and taken over the Republican Party, in my view. So that's one half of this upheaval in politics, the emergence of a novel kind of politics which does not fit neatly or conveniently into the established political categories. The other side of this, the flip side of this, is the progressive collapse and hollowing out of the traditional major parties. So at the moment in the United Kingdom, for example, the Conservative and the Labour Party, the traditional two big parties, are both polling at less than 20%. This is truly unprecedented. We've had one of our major political parties collapse before. The Liberal Party did this in the 1920s, but we've never had both of our big parties in such a state of decrepitude. But similar things are happening elsewhere. In Germany, for example, the two historic big parties, the SPD, Social Democrats, and the CDU, CSU, the Christian Democrats, they're currently in government together, but they're both polling at record low levels, particularly the SPD, which is polling at levels that would have made your eyebrows shoot off the top of your head had you posited them 20 years ago. And the same is true in one country after another. Traditional parties are suddenly finding their voters abandoning them. They're finding it very hard to deal with these insurgent parties, and also insurgent parties on the left, it has to be said. So in France, for example, at the moment, it looks as though there's quite a strong possibility that the next presidential election will be a runoff between Jordan Bardella or Marine Le Pen from the RN and Jean-Luc Mélenchon from the far left La France Insoumise. And the centre, represented by Emmanuel Macron, will have been swept away. Seems a very likely outcome. So those are the two sides of this political upheaval. And so the question that I'm seeking to explain is, well, what is actually going on? Why is this happening? And the main point of the book, the reason for the subtitle, Why the New Right is Here to Stay, is that this is not a temporary phenomenon. A lot of people think that this kind of upsurge of so-called populism is a kind of short-term temporary protest produced by maybe hard economic times, the incompetence of particular governments, and that if you can only get the politics right, it will go away. It will fade away in one way or another. It's increasingly, I think, the case. It's pretty obvious for everyone now. This is not true. This kind of politics is something permanent. It's going to be with us and determining or shaping a large part of the political debate for a long time. So what is going on? Well, my argument is that what we have had is a political realignment. Now, to explain what that is, in any political community, there are lots of issues that people disagree about. There's typically about 20 to 30 topics that are the subject of political debate. But you don't find that each person carries around with them their own individual, unique combination of views on these issues. Nor do you find that we elect individual independent legislators, MPs, who then form shifting ad hoc coalitions on an issue-by-issue basis. Instead, what you find everywhere, and it doesn't matter what your electoral system is, by the way, you always have two broad sides, which we conventionally call left and right. And these sides, they may be two big parties in the first-past-the-post system, maybe lots of smaller parties in a PR system, but they completely dominate politics. Everyone knows broadly whether they are anything from far left to far right, centre left. Everyone has a pretty clear idea of where they stand. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is that out of all those issues that people disagree about, there is typically one issue that has very high salience. It matters to a lot of people, and it matters a lot to them. It's very important to them. That's because that issue typically reflects very deep-rooted structural conflicts within society. Conflicts maybe of economic interest, maybe ethnic conflicts, maybe religious conflicts. Whatever it is, it reflects something that divides society in a very profound way. And that's why that issue matters to people. This is what you call the aligning issue. It's the issue that politics rotates around, and it's the issue that divides those two broad sides one from another. And people use their position on that issue to decide which of the two sides they're on, and they also use it to identify friends and foes. If somebody agrees with you on the aligning issue, even if they disagree about other things, they're on the same side as you. Conversely, even if you agree with somebody about some things, if they disagree with you on the aligning issue, they're your political opponent or even enemy. Now, the point about this is that, well, typically, I should add, by the way, that you typically have two aligning issues. You have a primary aligning issue, the big main one, and then you have a secondary one, which creates divisions within the two broad sides. And this divides the electorate typically into four broad blocks of voters or four broad political tendencies. The point is, these alignments are not permanent. They only last typically for about 40 to 50 years. And at the end of that period, they break down and you get a realignment. Now, this happens typically because the issue that politics is aligned around just stops mattering so much. Maybe one side gains a decisive victory and the other side becomes very much a minority position. Or maybe a modus vivendi or a consensus arises and people know, or maybe people just don't care about it as much as they used to. It's no longer got really high salience. And when that happens, a new aligning issue appears and politics restructures and reorients around that new issue. Now, what that means is that very often people discover that whereas they were, say, on the right of the old aligning issue, they're now on the left of the new one. Or conversely, they've gone from being left on the old issue to right on the new one. They discover that people they used to be allied to are now their opponents, and that people they used to be enemies of or opponents of are now their allies and friends. And this is very disconcerting for many people. It's because it means their map of politics no longer makes sense, and it takes a while for people to adapt to the new alignment. But my argument is that that is what is happening at the moment, or has happened actually in most countries. Now, what is the exact content of this realignment? Well, since roughly the 1920s, the dominant aligning issue in virtually every country has been capitalism versus socialism, or if you like, free markets versus government intervention. In other words, what defined right and left was the view you took of the role of government in the economy. If you believed that the government should have an active and prominent role in the economy, then you were on the left. Extreme left if you believed in communism or fallen socialism, moderate left if you believed in social democracy of the Scandinavian type or an interventionist economy. Conversely, if you believed that broadly free markets should be the way the economy is run, that put you on the right. And again, there's a variation from extreme laissez-faire at one end to moderate centre-right with a fair bit of intervention at the other. Now, my argument is that that is no longer the way that left and right are defined. Economics, I put, is no longer the dividing issue. People still care about economic issues, but it's no longer the issue that defines their identity. And there is sampling, there's evidence for this from various kinds of surveys and sociological samples of one kind or another. The new issue that now divides people is cosmopolitanism versus globalism. What defines you now is whether or not you broadly favour the nation state as the primary locus of politics and national democracy as the main form of political governance, or alternatively, you support a more globalised cosmopolitan form of governance in which national states and national electorates that elect those legislatures in those states are subject to or constrained by international rules and conventions of various kinds. This means that the key issues are no longer things like the level of taxation or whether or not the state should own a particular industry, although people still have opinions about that. The big issues now are questions like immigration. Should the government use force to expel illegal immigrants or even expel people who have acquired a right to live in a country and revoke their right to live there? These are the kind of issues that people now get very aerated about, as we can see currently in the United States, in Minneapolis, unfolding as we speak here. And so that's the new dividing issue. So the nature of left and right has changed. Left and right are no longer defined by economics. They're defined by this question of globalization versus cosmopolitanism. Now, what that means is there are free marketeers on both sides of the new divide. There are free market nationalists, there are free market cosmopolitans. There are also socialist cosmopolitans, and there are socialist nationalists. I have to be careful to put it that way round, because otherwise people might think I was casting aspersions. So that's that. You also find social conservatives on both sides, social liberals on both sides. And that was another issue that was very important in politics from the 60s through to about 8, 9 years ago, 10 years ago maybe. So we're in a new political world now. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing all this political upheaval. One of the reasons why we've got so many new parties arising is that the political class, the established political class in most countries, has been very reluctant to accept this shift in voters' priorities. They've not been prepared to address the concerns that voters have. And when the voters have expressed those concerns or have voted for politicians who express them, they've been told that they are racially prejudiced, and they've been, been measures taken in France, for example, to actually ban politicians, something I regard as being completely self-defeating. I should add, by the way, that I am not a supporter of the new kind of new right politics. Quite the contrary. I'm very much on the cosmopolitan side of this new divide. But I think that refusing to engage in debate or argument with these people, to simply dismiss them or to seek to shut them down through various means like banning parties, is not only wrong in itself, but also ultimately futile. And it's because the political class in one country after another has refused to address these issues that new parties have appeared and increasingly supplanted or undermined the old parties. So what we now have is, broadly speaking, a right-wing bloc, nationalist bloc, and a left-wing cosmopolitan bloc of voters in one country after another, with very little movement at the moment from one bloc to another. Voters typically do not swap sides between the nationalist bloc and the cosmopolitan bloc. They will start to do so maybe in 10, 15 years' time, but right now they're not. What you do have, however, is fighting like ferrets in a sack going on between the different tendencies and parties within each of those two blocks to try and establish which one becomes dominant. So, for example, there's a big fight going on, say, in Britain between people who want the new nationalist right to have a more free market orientation and those who want it to adopt a much more kind of dirigiste, neo-mercantilist position of the kind that, say, the RN in France advocates. So those kind of fights are going on within the two blocks. And that's going to be important for determining what the overall orientation of those blocks is. There's also an argument going on both sides between the more extreme groups within those blocks and the more moderate groups, which often correlates to or maps onto the division between what you might call the terminally online, who tend to be much more extreme, and the not so much online, who tend to be more moderated in their views. So that's another contest that's going on. Finally, what is driving all this? What's the explanation for this? Now, it may surprise you, given that I'm, an intellectual and I do work for think tanks, that I don't think ideas are the cause of this. I think ideas matter, but more as maps or explanations of something. I think that there's a materialist explanation for this, and that it has ultimately a material cause. That's because I think political and social identities and political outlooks are an outcome of, a product of, physical lived experience. I actually agree with Marx when he says that it's material conditions that determine consciousness and not the other way round. I think he's completely correct about that. And so it's actual physical lived experience that I think drives it. And I think there are a number of things that have happened in the world since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the 1970s, and particularly since the collapse of communism in 1989-90, that have produced this. The main one is a transformation of the world economy, which is produced by the collapse of exchange controls and the movement back to what we previously had in the 1870-1914 period, a world of completely unrestrained global investment flows. And what this has led to is a level of unprecedented economic integration driven by not trade, but investment. And it's led to much deeper integration of national economies. And what this has meant is two things. One of them is that the world is marked by massive migration flows, which are currently at very high levels and are likely to continue at that level for the next 10 to 15 years. I think they're going to diminish markedly after that for various reasons, but right now they're very, very high. And this is produced by the way in which those global investment flows have radically transformed the rural agricultural societies of the global south by commercializing agriculture in those parts of the world. This has raised the living standards of people in those parts of the world dramatically. But what it also means is that we have about 3 billion redundant farmers in places like Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America. And these people can no longer make a living or earn the income that they now require to buy essential goods in the countryside. So they're migrating to the cities. Most of them are migrating to cities in the global south, but a significant minority of them, 10% I would guess, which makes 300 million people roughly, are looking to migrate to the developed world. And that explains the migration, which is now causing a huge political reaction. The other thing that it has done is it has transformed the world economy in such a way that we no longer have, in any meaningful sense, national economies. Now, this is not just a spontaneous process. It reflects deliberate policy choices made by Western governments, particularly in the aftermath of the fall of communism. But we no longer have, in any meaningful sense, a French or British or even American economy. The world economy is now organized around about 600 to maybe 1,500 city regions, globally connected city regions. Somewhere like New York has closer connections in many ways with Tokyo or London or Paris, or indeed Mumbai or Shanghai, than it does with, say, the Midwest of the United States. And you can measure this by various metrics. And the big political divide in one country after another is between people who live in the globally connected metropolitan areas and work in those areas versus the people who live in rural areas and small towns and also in derelict ex-industrial areas. That's the basic political divide that you can see in one country after another. It's true, by the way, in India and Turkey as much as it is in, say, the United States or France. And the final thing that this has produced is that the way one country after another has chosen to organize its labor market is through meritocracy, through restricting access to high paid and, more importantly, high status roles within the metropolitan areas and the growing sectors of the economy to people who've been to university and got a formal degree. And this has led to a very profound cultural split between graduates, the lanyard class, as they're often called, and the broader society. A split which is as much to do with cultural attitudes and outlooks, and even mundane things like what brand you prefer, as it is to do with any kind of elaborated ideology. And it's those kind of processes and developments that I think have produced the realignment of politics that we're now seeing, where, as I say, in one country after another, we've moved away from the politics of economics, the politics of capitalism versus socialism, to this quite new political world of nationalism versus cosmopolitanism. And going forward, I think this is going to dominate politics for the next 40 or 50 years. Economics still matters, and there still is a division between free marketeers and statists, but it's very much the secondary issue now, and I think it's declining in importance for various reasons. And I suspect that within about less than 10 years, probably, it will be replaced by another issue as the secondary dividing issue in this new alignment. But we're a bit off that right now. And at that point, I'll stop.
Okay, so where does the climate scam fit in this whole thing? That I thought that was supposed to be the aligning issue, and we had to do everything with the climate in mind, and that's why we need global government. And it looks like that's crumbling.
Two things about that. Yes, the issue of climate change and climate policy does indeed fit into this new alignment in the way that you describe. Broadly speaking, the left side, the cosmopolitans, think that climate change is a real problem, a serious problem, and that we need global action, coordinated action by governments to deal with it. So it leads to policies like net zero, as found in the UK, a number of other European countries. Conversely, the populist side, one of its central campaigning claims in many countries, not all, by the way, but many, is opposition to climate change policy, to often the very idea of climate change. Now, that's very much an issue at the moment. I wouldn't say it's the primary one. I think that actually the reason why it's become a big issue in the new divide, apart from the fact that it does affect a lot of people, get a lot of people very irate and motivated on both sides, and therefore it's a good way to mobilize supporters. The other reason is that it does raise what is the central issue, which is the question of whether or not you should have global forms of governance through treaties and so on, which override the wishes and the choices made by national electorates. Now, I will say, though, and this is probably going to be welcome to you, I suspect, that I think this issue is going to decline dramatically in importance, because I think we are in the very early stages of a massive downplaying of the centrality of climate change on the left of this new alignment. One of the things you may have noticed yourself, I've certainly noticed it, is a number of people, notably Bill Gates, coming out with statements saying, well, a few years ago I was saying that climate change was, going to kill us all if we didn't do X, Y, and Z, and we need to do these. Saying, well, it's bad, but it's not as bad as I thought. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this. And my rather cynical explanation is that this is because he and many people like him have come to the realization that they can either have net zero policies or they can have AI data centers, but they can't have both because of the enormous energy requirements of AI data centers. And what they've concluded is they really, really want AI data centers for various reasons. They think it's a get out of jail free card for various problems they face, basically. And therefore, they're going to significantly downplay the centrality and importance of climate change. And I think you're going to find quite a lot of major media outlets and other, mouthpieces of what you might call loosely the establishment changing their tune in the next 4 to 5 years. Now, I should say, by the way, my own view is that there is climate change and it is a problem, but it's not a catastrophic or civilization threatening problem of the kind that it's often presented as being, much less something that's going to end life on Earth, which is a kind of nonsensical claim that's often made by people. Nonsensical because the planet has frequently in its geological history been significantly warmer than it is now. And No question of life being wiped out in any of those previous episodes. So I think that basically what we've had is various people, for reasons of their own, I think it's fair to say, exaggerating the severity of what I think is a real phenomenon, but exaggerating the severity of it and using it as an excuse to push an agenda that they support actually for other reasons as well. And now that they've realized that this involves them in trade-offs that they don't want to make, because they really, really want those AI data centers and AI, they've decided they're pulling back from it. So I think that right now it is a big issue. But I think in about 4 or 5 years' time, it will be much less so.
So just as an example, you mentioned you're on the cosmopolitan side mostly, but you don't agree with the globalist, we need globalist solutions for climate change, right? So it's okay to not agree with them on everything. Yeah.
No, I absolutely. Well, let me explain my own position there, which is not a unique one. There are many other people like me, but it's still a minority one. Most people think that if you don't want decisions to be made entirely at the level of national governments, then the only option you have is to go for global agreements, global government structures of one kind or another, international commissions, international conventions, things that bind government which are enforced by national courts. I don't think that is true. I think that's a false dichotomy, actually. For one thing, I think that institutions like that are just not going to work. I mean, they're going to fail on their own terms. They are not going to achieve the ends that the people who advocate them have in mind. Now, take, for example, the Confederation on Trade in Endangered Species, the CITES policy. You can clearly show, I think, that policy actually makes the problem of species extinction worse, not better. And that the mechanisms that it's set up to prevent trade in endangered species are actually so prone to corruption and people actors, bad faith actors cheating on them, that actually they simply don't work. And you can show that, in fact, what it actually does is make things worse because of the perverse incentives it creates for bad actors of various kinds. And so I think that if you do have a global problem, or you have a problem which goes beyond national borders, the idea that therefore you need to create something like a bodged attempt at a global government to deal with it is completely the wrong response. There are two much more reasonable responses. One of them is to say what you want is much more old-fashioned collaboration between sovereign global government and national governments. You could go down that route. Where global governments do agree not to treaties that bind themselves, but to practical steps. What I would advocate is that you actually have non-governmental institutions that do this. Ones that don't derive their power from the sovereign state, but which enable actual private actors, firms, individuals, organizations and the like, to cooperate and collaborate with each other across national borders. And I think that sounds like a pipe dream, but I actually would argue that empirically that is a much more successful way of addressing problems of that kind. Problems like, for example, trade in endangered species. The other thing you need to do, of course, obviously, is to do things that don't create perverse incentives for people. And very often what you find with a lot of these conventions is that they do precisely that. I mean, I mentioned CITES. Another example would be the conventions that have been set up to deal with trade in prohibited drugs and substances. All these do is to create enormously powerful incentives for people to go into organized crime trading these substances. And they certainly don't achieve their purported aim, which is to stop the trade in stuff like cocaine coming from Latin America. So there are other ways of addressing those problems which don't require this kind of supranational structure. So I am broadly on the cosmopolitan side. I don't believe in national autarky. I don't believe that you can have a world where you try to de-integrate national economies, as some people want to. But on the other hand, I'm not, therefore, in favor of giving lots of power to the UN, the World Bank, the IMF or the EU or other supranational organizations. I think that's a complete blind alley.
So speaking of the UN, and to me, it seems like they kind of pushed all their chips in on the climate thing. They've gone so hard on this. Do you think that the death of the climate hysteria is going to affect the UN in general, or the COP meetings? Are they going to just end in the next few years? Or are they going to still be doing that?
I doubt those will end because they're too much of a useful jolly for lots of people, basically. However, I think the United Nations has much bigger problems to think about and deal with than that, which arise from geopolitical shifts. Essentially, the United Nations was originally created as a kind of agreement between the Soviet Union, the United States, and the other victorious powers in World War II to set up a kind of cartel through which they'd run the world. That then didn't work because of the emergence of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Since the end of the Cold War, it has basically been dominated by the United States, because the United States has had a preeminent position in world affairs for various obvious reasons. Preeminent military power, dominating the world financial system, world's largest economy. This is now coming to an end. And we're now moving into a world which is much more like the world of, say, the 19th century in Europe. A world of, as it's often described, a multipolar world of 4 or 5 competing regional great powers. And it's pretty clear from the national security statement that the United States government brought out a couple of months ago that the US government has accepted this. It's accepted that the idea of US global hegemony is neither possible nor, crucially, desirable. And that they're looking essentially to make a deal with the Chinese and carve the world up. They're looking to become the paramount power in the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, and they're looking the other side of that deal, which is unspoken, but it's pretty clear what it is to allow the Chinese to be the predominant power in large parts of East Asia, India, perhaps in South Asia. Now, what that means is you're dealing with a world where diplomacy is not going to be conducted through instruments like the United Nations much longer. And when there is a need for coordination or high-level agreement on, areas like, say, trade, freedom of the seas, or things of that sort, this will be done through agreements between the great powers rather than using the UN. So I think the role the UN has had, either as the place where great power disagreements were acted out, which is what it did in the Cold War, or as an instrument through which the dominant faction in the United States exercised not exactly control, but a sort of influence over global affairs, I think that's come to an end. And the most dramatic sign of this is the fact that the United States government has now withdrawn from a huge long list of international organizations, including many of those which are part of what you might call the UN family or association of, in some cases, I think, rather foolishly, but nonetheless, this shows the fact that there's a big switch to American unilateralism. People say this, it's just Donald Trump. But actually, I think it reflects something which will outlive Trump, even if the Democrats win the next election in the United States. I don't think the United States is going to go back to the kind of policy it was following under, say, the Obama administration or even the George W. Bush one. It's going to be much more unilateral, much more nationalistic. And similarly, I think the Chinese and other emergent great powers, the Russians, the Indians, maybe the EU, they're also going to operate much more on direct bilateral rules. And so I think the UN is going to become a much less significant organization. It will still exist. It's still a place where you can give diplomats that you don't want to actually fire a well-paid, cushy job. So it provides a lot of useful patronage, basically. So I think it's still going to survive. But I don't think it's going to have anything like the kind of importance it's had in recent years. And I think COP, climate talks, I doubt they will end, but I think it's become obvious to everyone, regardless of the view they take, that they're a complete waste of time and a waste of money. I mean, even if you're, a strong environmentalist, you're not going to be a fan of COP. So I think basically they will be enormously downsized going forward.
Yeah. So speaking of wasting money, what do you think of just the massive debts around the developed world, that so much money printing? Do you think we're going to see currency collapses and austerity, or it's got to end at some point, or how does this end?
Well, that's a good question. This is another part of the backdrop to this kind of shift in politics that I'm talking about. When you say correctly, we've got massive debts. I mean, the United States at the moment is running a budget deficit of $1 trillion a year, roughly. And I didn't even know myself what a trillion was a few, years ago. A way to put that into perspective is that if you spend $1 million a day, every day from the birth of Jesus to now, at the end of that period, $1 million every day, you still haven't spent $1 trillion. and which is the amount the US government is borrowing every year. Now, why are they doing this? It's not only the United States. Japan, all the European countries, France most notably, but also the UK, they're all, issuing sovereign debt like there's no tomorrow. What drives this? Well, the answer, I'm afraid, is people like me, old people. That's what it is, basically. If you look at the United States, for example, Paul Krugman, New York Times columnist, of course, and famous economist, rather wittily said that the way to understand the US federal government is that it's an old age pension and sickness insurance company that happens to have a big military. And that is actually spot on. If you look at the largest items in the US federal budget, there's payment on the debt, interest on the national debt, defense, and by the way, interest on the debt is now bigger than the defense budget, which is not a good sign. And then Medicare, health care for elderly people, Medicaid, healthcare for poor people, and Social Security. And they've just cut back Medicaid. The two big ones by far, and the ones that are really growing dramatically, are Social Security and Medicare, particularly Medicare. And it's the same in the UK. If you look at the recently, a centre-left think tank actually in the UK did a model which showed that even if you hold all other public spending constant, then by about 15 years from now, in order to meet the obligations that will inevitably arise for pensions and health spending on the elderly, given the aging population, you'll have to have the government spending between 65 and 70% of GDP. Now, and that's with every other area of public spending standing still. Now, the point is, this just isn't going to happen. It's physically impossible. If you look at the size of the pension obligations that developed countries have to their aging populations, it is physically impossible to produce the amount of output that's needed to provide those older people with the various kinds of services that they are entitled to under the law as it stands. And if something's physically impossible, it's not going to happen. Now, what is going to happen? Well, either we have mass euthanasia of the elderly, and I hope that that will not happen for obvious reasons, or governments will default on their pension liabilities. And I think that I think that's what they will do. Now, how they default is another matter. What may well happen, this goes back to your point about currency collapse, what they may well do is inflate the debt away. In other words, they may well print money to meet their ever-rising obligations, knowing that in doing this, given that the productive capacity won't rise to match it, that they're going to have inflation. But inflation has the, from their point of view, beneficial effect of inflating away the value of the debt. So it's another way of defaulting. So I suspect that's what they will do. I wouldn't like to be a politician, though, who's in power when this happens. Now, the other thing to mention also, though, is that the United States is in a particularly vulnerable position at the moment, because right now, the reason why it can borrow $1 trillion a year from the rest of the world is because it has what Giscard d'Estaing, French finance minister at the time, called the exorbitant privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency, which means that everybody in the world wants dollars, not just Americans, because dollars are used for international trade. And they're the reserve currency, so every central bank wants to keep dollars in its reserve portfolio. And this enables them, therefore, to fund truly humongous deficits, much bigger than they would be able to fund if this were not the case. Now, this is increasingly less true. If you look at the moment, the dollar is declining steadily, and this is partly by design. Donald Trump and his Treasury Secretary actually want the dollar to decline for various reasons. But at the same time, also, central banks are basically switching out of dollars into gold and silver like there's no tomorrow. And similarly, a lot of private investors are de-dollarizing. They're using their dollar balances to buy not dollar assets, but commodities, basically, and other things like real estate in various parts of the world. And they're shifting out of dollars. Hence, the dollar's exchange rate for other currencies is declining. Now, what could well happen in the next decade or so, or the next 5 years, it would happen slowly and then suddenly, is that the dollar ceases to be have that world currency, reserve currency status. That doesn't mean it will be replaced. Creating a world reserve currency is very difficult. What is more likely is it will go back to the situation we had in the 1930s when we didn't have a world reserve currency. But what that will mean, well, probably national bankruptcy for the United States, because they'll suddenly find that they can't finance that deficit any longer. And that will be a case of the chickens coming home to roost. So I wouldn't want to win the next presidential election in the United States. You're looking at some really, really rough times ahead, in my view.
How big of a problem do you think the just straight up looting of the public treasury is? There is a time when I thought that at least they were spending the money on sick people, et cetera, but now it sounds like a lot of money is going for a daycare for kids that do not exist and that type of thing.
That's undoubtedly a lot of that going on, and a lot of public spending is, if you like, make work for people. And this is something, by the way, it's not only a feature of government spending, it's a feature of a lot of the private sector as well. We have at the moment a great deal of what, as well as outright graft, daycare for people who don't exist and other kind of fiddles and frauds of that kind. You also have an awful lot of what John Michael Greer, the archdruid, calls Linocracy, which means literally the rule of pimps, which is where people who don't actually contribute anything productive nevertheless can hold up things from happening unless they're paid off, typically by signing off some elaborate permit form. And so you get an enormous amount of that going on in both the public sector through regulatory agencies and the like, and the private sector through various layers of middle management, often created in response to state regulation. But in terms of things like the outright welfare fraud that you're talking about, the obvious case being the big recently revealed one in Minnesota, although it's a large sum of money in the absolute sense, compared to the amount of money that is spent on things like pensions, so Social Security, and health Medicare payments, it's actually small. That's the really alarming thing about it. I mean, you look at the figures that have been embezzled, under Tim Walz's watch in Minnesota, and you think, good God, that's an enormous amount of money, and it is. But the amount of money that the US federal government spends on these other things is so big that in terms of that context, it's not actually that much. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do something about it, of course. You should. And you should be looking all the time to, make the government more efficient, cut out all this kind of, useless and often openly corrupt spending. But unless you address the big elephants in the room, which is basically Medicare and Social Security, you're not going to be able to bring that budget deficit under control.
So how worried do you think we all should be about this dystopia that could be coming up, where we all have a digital ID and somebody at the top is controlling it? And if you say the wrong thing on social media, you can't buy groceries or you can't leave your 15-minute city, that type of thing.
Very worried in one sense. There's no doubt there are lots of people there who have the idea or design that we should live in a world of digital supervision, if you will. And there are a number of specific concrete things which we should, A, be worried about, but B, should also do things we can all do in our everyday life to counteract it. One of them, for example, is the move to digital currency, and particularly digital currencies issued by central banks. This is a very, very bad idea. Not economically so much. It is a bad idea economically as well, but the main reason for objecting to it is the civil liberties obligations. Because if you have no cash, if cash is abolished, which a lot of central bankers want to do, and you rely entirely on digital currencies issued by the central bank, that means that the government can, if you annoy it, cut you off from any purchasing power, leaving you dependent on barter to get what you need. And that's an incredible power. You do not want to give governments that kind of power. And this should be a non-ideological point, because the question to ask anyone, regardless of their politics, is, look, imagine the government is controlled by the politician you most hate and fear. Do you want them to have that power? And the answer should obviously be, hell no, you don't want that to happen. Now, what can you do about that? Well, the answer is use cash. Don't take the easy option of always and only using contactless payment, digital payments, and things of that sort. Insist on using cash. Keep stores of cash in your house. And so I think we should be very worried about this. We are potentially moving towards a dystopia where we are constantly under surveillance. We are constantly watched by digital sleuths of various kinds. And there's a kind of record compiled of what we do. And on the basis of that profile, you can suddenly find that you are suddenly downgraded. Your credit is downgraded. You can't do various things. Maybe you get a knock on the door at night. It could take a very dark form. But the answer is that there are ways around this. Now, the kind of poster boy in both a bad and a good sense for this is China, the Chinese People's Republic, where we have this social credit scheme, so-called. It isn't national, by the way. That's a misconception. Each province in China typically has its own slightly different variation of this, but the party has pushed it broadly across the board. The point is that already what you can see is signs in China that the Chinese public are finding all kinds of ways of evading this and manipulating it, creating, for example, there's a thriving black market economy in creating fake IDs so that you can do an end run around this. And it's worth saying, by the way, that the Chinese are the world's greatest experts at evading and undermining bureaucratic controls. The reason being they've had 2,500 years of practice, given that they've got a state that has existed for that long. And so that they're extremely adept at doing that. In India, I mean, good luck with anyone who tries to impose that kind of system on the fundamentally chaotic society that India is. So there are ways around this. And I think what it requires is people to interact with each other more through personal connections, and not simply interact with each other purely through this kind of format, to be quite frank, online. And it's all very useful and very good in many ways. But if you're going to escape from that kind of digital dystopia that you describe, the thing to do is to build up other kinds of connections, other kinds of links, other kind of associations, which means that you're not, A, a large part of what you do will not create a digital footprint, and B, you have other ways of acquiring information, getting information out there, which are not subject to control by not just the government, but also large private entities. I mean, I'm not a fan of large tech corporations and their algorithms or people of that sort. We should be not quite as worried about them as we are about the government, because they don't dispose of deadly force, but they're still not our friends.
Let's see. I think I saw on Twitter that you described yourself as a fan of open borders, or an open borders person. Can you tell us more about that, about your stance and what the laws should be, or how should we enforce them?
Well, my view is I do make a distinction between what you might call my ideal world, which is a world of completely open borders, and the world that is currently practicable, which is one where you don't have that. You have to have some kind of controls. The reason being that the various parts of the world, the consequences of having a completely open border would be simply too disruptive right now. However, I do think that that's what you should aim for. Now, why do I say that? Well, for several reasons, really. The first is that from an economist's point of view, if somebody moves around the world in search of higher income through, moving from a place where they earn a lower income to one where they earn a higher income, what they're doing is they are moving their labor, which they control, to a place where it's more productive. So to the extent that people are free to do this, you're going to have more production, more stuff, in other words. And various people have constructed economic models where they try to work out what the effect of a completely open borders world would be. And the overwhelming consensus is that it would more than double the total output of the planetary economy. Now, broadly speaking, that's a good thing. The problem we have at the moment is there are lots of things in place which would mean that wouldn't happen. Welfare states, for example, being a prominent case in point, which is one of the reasons why I think you can't get to that, as far as I'm concerned, utopia of completely free movement. But you should still seek to encourage that to do that. And the way the world economy is now organized, as I say, means that much of the way the world works at the moment depends on global labor flows. One of the arguments I make in the book is that you cannot have a world of free capital movement and not have an integrated labor market. If you allow capital to move around the world freely, there is bound to be nearly free, or much freer than would otherwise be the case, movement of labor. So if for cultural or political reasons you decide you don't want to have free movement of labor, then you're going to have to restrict capital movements. There's no way out of that, in my view. And, at the moment, there are too many people, I think, on the nationalist side of my new divide who want to have their cake and eat it. They think you can have global investment markets and things of that sort and still have very tight immigration controls. The other thing I would say is this. If you want to control movement of people across borders, you are going to have to control the people within those borders. For example, let's say, for example, you only want certain people who come across your border to be able to work, and they have to have an official document from the government that says they can work. Now, to the extent that you do that, to enforce it, to make that more than just a kind of bit of grandstanding, you're going to have to impose checks and inspections on people like local employers, local landlords. You're going to have controls, in other words, on the people who live within the country. If you want to have really tight controls of movement in and out of the country, increasingly in the modern world, the world we actually live in, you have to have something like a national identity card, a way that people within the country can identify themselves, which they can be asked to produce on demand. One of the reasons why Britain sees very large-scale migration from other parts of the world, more so than some other parts of Europe, is because we don't have a national identity card. And therefore, it's much more difficult for the state in Britain, even if it wanted to control people coming into the country and working, even if they're not legally entitled to do so. So if you want to if you don't want a world in which the government can demand you produce papers and can, have things like a national ID and enforce it, then you can't have really tight immigration controls. Sorry, the two things are incompatible. Now, the final thing I would say is that people, there's a lot of this argument is conducted in terms of economics, and people saying, oh, the people who come in are a net drain on the public purse. They're actually making people worse off and things of that sort. On the other side, you have people saying, well, if you don't have immigration coming in, you're not going to get GDP growth. And there's actually some truth in both sides of that argument. But the point is that from an economist point of view and from an analytical point of view, movement within a country is no different in terms of the effects it has from movement across a geopolitical border. Now, you may say, yeah, but movement within a country doesn't produce socially transformative effects. Well, maybe not. I mean, within the United States, for example, in the course of the 20th century, from roughly the mid-1920s through to the mid to late 1960s, you had an enormous internal migration from the old Confederacy and the Appalachians into the northern cities. That was a movement entirely within the United States, and it totally transformed American society. Similarly, in China, since 1980, roughly, there's been a movement of several 100 million people from rural China, particularly western and central China, to the coastal provinces. And I don't know if you realize, but in China, there are about a dozen different spoken languages. There's one written language, but there's a dozen or so spoken languages. So this was an enormously significant migration. It's completely transformed the demography of places like Guangdong, Shanghai, the Yangtze Delta, Shandong, because of all these people moving there. It's probably the biggest migration in human history, but it took place entirely within a geopolitical unit. So if you are against large-scale demographic change and its transformative effects, and there are reasons why you might be against that, I can understand that position, then basically what you have is an argument against movements per se. If you're, for example, you want to preserve traditional Welsh society in the UK, you're probably going to be against English people buying cottages in Wales or Cornwall, if you're a Cornish nationalist, and moving there. So the idea that movement is it's all about having discrete, homogeneous national cultures that you can fence off is actually not true. That's not how it works. It's a common idea in Britain because we have had the unusual experience of having nearly 1,000 years with very little migration. Britain is unusual in that respect. If you look at the continent, you've had migration across borders all the time for the last, 1,000 years or so. It's not a modern phenomenon. It's just increased in the modern world because of easier transportation and things like that.
Yeah, so I agree that in an ideal world, we would bring in more labor, but I think we need to be choosy because we might be bringing in crime and fraud. I think it's important to enforce the laws. Yeah.
It's the thing. There's a straightforward thing there. There are two things to say there. First of all, the question is: are the groups that is the labor that the groups that are coming in, the ethnic or other groups that you're importing for labor or being imported by employers basically as labor, are they disproportionately more likely than the indigenous population to have people who will commit crimes? That's an empirical question, and I think the answer is in some cases yes. In other cases, no. Now, you can answer that quite straightforwardly and empirically. And if you think that, in that case, you need to think, well, okay, maybe it's not worth doing it. By the way, the main rule that I would say as a kind of rough rule of thumb public policy in this is that you should be very cautious about allowing inward migration from parts of the world that have strongly clan-based societies. So I would, if I was an American citizen, I would be fairly relaxed about migration from West Africa or the Caribbean, but not so much from Somalia or Afghanistan, because those are two very, very strongly clan-based societies. And clan-based societies typically, the problem is that they are marked by ways of behaving, ways of living, which are functional and adaptive in those parts of the world, but which are highly dysfunctional and maladaptive when you move to the city. By the way, it's not just a matter of moving to another part of the world. These are basically very much rural parts of the world, dominated by an extended kin group system. And people who live in that part of the world, in the mountains up in Central Asia or Afghanistan or northern and rural Somalia, when they move to a city anywhere, they're going to find that they're living in a way that is highly maladaptive. Part of it is that you only trust your cousins, basically. You don't trust or have law-abiding relations with people that you're not related to. And that's deeply destructive in a commercial society. So that would be one of the rough rules of thumb I would make. And again, also, what you can say is, well, do you want to import more skilled labor or more less skilled labor? That's not an easy question. You might actually want more less skilled labor because a lot of the jobs that, taking the UK case, for example, a lot of the migration into the UK at the moment is for two jobs specifically: casual labor in agriculture, picking vegetables and things like that during the harvest season, and working in the care sector, looking after elderly people who are infirm. Both of these are relatively unskilled and low-paid jobs. Now, the locals are not prepared to do them, or at least not at a wage rate that makes them economically viable. Now, in that case, what you actually want is unskilled labor. So people tend to think, oh, what you want to do is bring in people on H-1B visas who can, do code, but you might actually want to bring in unskilled labor. It depends on what your labor market is. Now, what I would say is, I don't think the government has any kind of magical way of working out what kind of labor it is the economy wants, any more than they can plan any other aspect of the economy. It's down to the employers, really, who will have a better idea of whether they want skilled or unskilled labor. And you should leave it up to them, essentially. But I do think, given that we're not in that perfect world, you probably do need to have a policy of saying that there are certain kinds of migration that you want to have less of because it has certain kinds of downstream risk. I mean, this is not a new argument. This was the argument made over, say, Italian immigration into the United States in the 1890s and 1900s because of the highly clan-based nature of Sicilian society in particular, which, of course, as we all know, did lead to certain consequences in the United States when Prohibition was introduced. Now, these kind of things do sort themselves out over time, but it can take quite a long time, and you might decide quite reasonably as a matter of public policy you don't want to do that.
Okay, we're coming up to the end of our hour here. Any other points you want to make before we wrap up?
Not really. Just we should all be looking forward to a rather exciting and bumpy ride in politics in the next 10 to 20 years. And we're definitely in a new political world right now. So throw out those old maps you have of politics and forget about the old political labels. We're in quite a new one now.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve Davies. We'll talk to you next time. Goodbye.
My pleasure. Thank you.